We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares.
Welcome to Changing Our World. I'm Linda Weltner, your host, and today we're going to travel to Cuba. We have as our guest Avi Chomsky, known to her friends as Avi, who teaches a course on history, study, and a travel seminar, which means that the kids get to know all about the history of the country and then they get to go there. So Avi has just returned from a trip with her students from Cuba, but it's a very familiar place to her because she lived there for 4 months in 1995.
Yeah.
And she's been back in 2012, 2013, 2015. So whatever your beliefs or prejudices, from reading our corporate media, you're going to get another point of view about Cuba. Cuba is our enemy. We had to have a blockade and stop them from whatever they were trying to do to us. What do you make of that?
Yeah, people in the United States tend to have this idea that Cuba is somehow this dangerous threat to the United States. And often if you ask them why, the only thing they can come up with is the missile crisis, which of course was in 1962. That was quite a while ago. But they say so they, they installed missiles there, and so that's why they're a threat, and that's why we have to do all these things. But one thing that people forget is that prior to Cuba installing those missiles, we had just invaded the country in April of 1961 in the Bay of Pigs, which I visited on this trip, actually. And that Cuba was under a barrage of attacks from the United States at the time.
There were many attempts to kill Castro, correct?
There were many attempts to kill Castro. The United States, by the end of 1959, the United States government had agreed on a multi-agency plan to overthrow the Cuban government and eliminate Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution by any means necessary. And that included invading the country. It included multiple terrorist attacks against the country, the bombing of the economic infrastructure, sabotage.
You mean real bombing?
Yes, real
planes
bombing.
Planes, plantations.
Planes, dropping bombs.
Yeah, which I had never heard of.
Economic sabotage, blowing up of Cuban airliners, assassination attempts against Fidel Castro, and the sponsoring of numerous terrorist organizations on U.S. soil made up of Cuban exiles, armed and trained by the CIA, the goal of which was to infiltrate the country and overthrow its government.
And this was before Cuba had done anything, right? Castro had overthrown Batista and was trying to go in a non-colonial direction, right? Be independent.
Right. Well, within a year of the July 26th movement coming into power through a revolution in Cuba in 1959. So by the end of the 1959, the United States had made this commitment to overthrowing the Cuban government by any means possible. So the fact that Cuba was trying to defend itself then turns into aggression because you're not allowed to defend yourself against attacks from the United States. So this sort of
and so one of the attacks too was to call it dangerous and to convince the Americans that somehow they were terrorists and bad, right?
So in fact, there have been no acts of Cuban aggression against the United States. Zero, not a single one. There have been no Cuban attacks against the United States. There have been no terrorist attacks by Cuba on the United States or on anybody else for that matter. And the hostility has really been a one-way street. That is, Cuba has never tried to intervene in the internal affairs of the United States. Do you know how many times U.S. troops have landed in Cuba?
Beside the Bay of Pigs?
Starting in 1898, over and over again throughout the 20th century, and the United States still maintains a military base on Cuban soil. Cuba maintains no military bases in the United States. And since the revolution of 1959, Cuba has repeatedly demanded that the United States remove its base in Guantanamo.
And we send them some small check, and Castro never cashed them. So we tried to make it legitimate, like we're renting it, but we are doing it against their will. We took that land, rental. Right? All right, so they're more sinned against than sinning, as far as that goes. So you took your kids over there, And what kinds of things did you do?
So we spent about 5 days in Havana and 3 days in the countryside. And in our trip to the countryside, I've done this trip numerous times with my students, so we've visited different places, parts of rural Cuba. But this time, we went to the Bay of Pigs, which the Cubans call Playa Girón. So we stayed in a little beach community there in private houses, and we visited the Bay of Pigs Museum, and we saw
And did
the
any
Bay
of the
Pigs from
people you
other
visited
side.
remember?
We didn't specifically seek out older people or interview
okay.
people. We did go to the museum, and there's some really nice billboards there. One of them is "Hasta aquí llegaron los mercenarios." It shows the furthest point that the invaders got up to before they were turned around by the Cuban troops and armed militias, armed Cuban population. And there's another one that says Playa Girón, la primera derrota del imperialismo yanqui en el hemisferio. Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs, the first defeat of U.S. imperialism in the hemisphere.
Right. And
So
they
the
must
Cubans
have
are
felt
very
like
proud of
David
that.
against Goliath,
Yes,
really.
it
That
has
was
been
one of
David
the
against
first, you know,
Goliath.
we like to think we won all our wars, but that was one of the first defeats that we faced when they weren't welcoming us with open arms, right? And so what else did you do?
And so in Havana, we did a lot of art and cultural activities. That was
yeah,
one
they-
of the emphases here.
I went to the museum in Havana. One of the first things that Castro did was to decide that he wanted to showcase the art. And think of a government putting a value on art while we're canceling all our art classes in school and stuff, but the museum has wonderful stuff in it. And they have city art, too.
So we actually heard a lot of music.
Oh, yeah, the music's
We met with a bunch of several different groups of young Cuban musicians, classical music, popular music. We spent a whole day looking at how the system of consumption works, like where Cubans get their food and what are the different ways that Cubans have access to food in the different levels of the market. We met with a lot of academics and researchers who talked to us about what's happening with the Cuban economy, what's happening with Cuba-U.S. relations. And students also had a lot of free time, because I think that's really important in Cuba for students to, it's an extremely friendly country, it's an extremely safe area.
And do the people like Americans?
People there are incredibly welcoming of Americans. People of all different political opinions are welcoming of Americans. Those who are strong supporters of the revolution welcome Americans because they want to show Americans the accomplishments of the revolution. People who are opponents of the revolution welcome Americans because they feel that America represents the alternative, like that they would like for their country. So yeah, Americans are always really surprised, because often in traveling around the world you encounter anti-Americanism, but it's amazing that the country that we've been the most hostile to, you really don't encounter that. And Cubans who are strong supporters of the revolution and strong opponents of U.S. policy still welcome Americans, because they feel it's their chance to show Americans that Cuba isn't everything we've learned here that it is.
Now, we have, I believe, just cut food stamps, or at least in the new Republican budget, there's planning to cut food stamps, and a certain number of kids go to bed hungry every night. What is the state of hunger with the food distribution there?
So that has varied a lot over the years, and there's a billboard in Havana that says, it was a remark made by some Cuban official at the United Nations, I can't remember who said, like, around the world, millions of children go to bed hungry every night, but none of them are in Cuba. I don't think that is actually totally accurate for all moments of the Cuban Revolution, but provision of food, adequate food to the population has been absolutely a priority of the government.
Even when they had shortages?
Even when they had shortages. And when I first arrived in Cuba in 1995, I would say on the contrary, almost every child and adult in Cuba went to bed hungry every night. Now hungry, of course there's different levels of hunger. But the feeling when I got there in 1995, and you know, we have to contextualize this historically, Cuba's economy had been extremely dependent on its relations with the Soviet bloc, with trade and aid from the Soviet bloc, and the collapse of that in 1989 through 91 just completely pulled the rug out from under Cuba's economy, and the country was in deep, deep crisis. There simply was not enough food on the island, and the government took very strong measures to equally distribute what was available. Which means
so it wasn't the people with money ate and the people without didn't. There was a distribution of food that cost pennies to give you a basic diet.
Yes. And that's why I can say almost everyone on the island went to bed hungry every night, but nobody died of starvation.
Right.
As opposed to in a so-called free market or open market system, where some people are going to have plenty to eat and some people are actually going to die of starvation.
And then I think you said that there's also, once you get your basic foods, there's subsidized food. They have that in Venezuela too, where the government makes the food, basic foods, less expensive. And then there are farmers markets. Now there are capitalist farmers who grow their crops and then they sell them for reasonable prices at the market.
Not always reasonable prices, but they sell them at the prices they choose at the market.
Oh,
That's how
all right, so it's
capitalism
not
works, right?
government controlled, okay. And then there are the specialty stores that carry all our curry or whatever the capitalist countries come up with.
And there's two currencies in Cuba. So what you call the specialty stores are stores that operate in what are called CUCs, which are convertible Cuban pesos, which are pegged to the dollar.
Okay.
So you have to have foreign currency. You have to have access to foreign currency to be able to shop in these specialty stores. They're run by the government, but they operate essentially in dollars. And they sell
can you go to a
imported
bank
goods.
and change pesos for dollars?
You can, but the exchange rate that is, so one CUC, which is essentially the equivalent of a dollar, is worth about 27 Cuban pesos.
Oh, okay.
An average Cuban salary is perhaps 300 to 400 Cuban pesos a month. So it comes out to practically nothing if you're turning it into dollars.
Okay.
So while it's legally possible to go into a currency exchange and exchange your Cuban pesos for dollars, nobody has enough Cuban pesos. Nobody earns enough Cuban pesos in order to make that a really viable alternative.
But you might do without, say, pomegranate jelly, but your pesos would buy you a decent meal.
Back in the mid-90s, that was not really the case. That is, the food was just not there. But now it is the case. That is, now the variety and availability of food in the peso market is such that I think we can say again that nobody's going to bed hungry in Cuba.
Now, also, they have something that you will not believe. People can live in various places, and they pay 10% of their income in rent. So you might have two comparable places, and one person would be paying 1,000 pesos and another might be paying 100. Is that correct?
Well, that was the initial urban reform of the 1960s. There's been numerous steps taken since then. So most Cubans actually own their homes now. Few people rent. Almost everybody owns their homes.
That's sort of the American dream, to own your own home.
Well, but many of these are very small apartments. And one of the ways that the Cuban government, the socialist project of the Cuban government, indeed, was to do away with landlords. That is, the property was taken by the state, and that's how the rents were. So you're only allowed to own the place that you live in. You're not allowed to own rental properties. Now, this is something that has been slowly changing as the economy has opened in the last 20 years. So that when I first traveled there in 1995, no rental was allowed at all, except the state. Rented. No private rentals were allowed at all. And that was still the case when I first arrived there in 1995. But there's been a slow opening of rentals to foreigners so that Cubans are allowed to use their homes as a way of bringing in foreign currency, because this desperate need for foreign currency. So now Airbnb is operating in Cuba. So it's really gone, like, almost, the opening has been quite dramatic in that. Another way that the Cuban housing market has opened in the time since I've been there, and this is actually just since Raul Castro came into power, has been people are allowed to buy and sell their property. That's something that was not allowed, and the reason that it was not allowed was to prevent real estate speculation.
From getting higher and higher. So we've got a country where people have enough food to eat now, and are there homeless people wandering the streets?
No.
No. So people have a place to live, even if it might be small, and it might not have fancy furniture, right?
And it might have several generations.
And it might have several generations, which I would like myself. I have to live alone, and my grandchildren live elsewhere. But the third thing is free medical care and free education. through college. So if you don't have a lot of pesos, you still get the things that are costing like $50,000 a year to go to college.
Yes, most of what we spend our money on here is in fact completely subsidized or heavily subsidized in Cuba. So the salaries look really low, and in terms of purchasing power, they are low, but in terms of expenses, Cubans have practically none. That is, public transportation is practically free, utilities are practically free, most people pay no rent, childcare and education is free, healthcare is free, so that the big items in our budget, Cubans really aren't dealing with.
And as what I know about, because I went on a medical stream, is that the education for the doctors is good. It's excellent. So it's not like they're getting a second-rate education. And I went into an elementary school too, and the kids were really attentive. It was really fun to watch them.
Oh yeah, we visited a school on this trip.
And
also.
the kids seemed to be very invested in what the teacher, I think because they have so few electronic gadgets, the teachers make themselves very magnetic. All right, so we have this country that seems to be spending most of its money making sure its people are cared for, okay? And from what I've heard from you, it, in solidarity with other countries, is helping people not with money, because it doesn't have money, but with medical help, right?
Cuba has a huge medical aid program, the largest in the world, larger than the United States, larger even than the World Health Organization. It has medical personnel in Africa, elsewhere in Latin America. Creating a foreign aid program, particularly through medical aid, has been really characteristic of the Cuban Revolution since the very early days. And I should say just something else about the medical education, is that there's several levels of medical care in Cuba, and most doctors are trained to be primary care physicians.
Right.
Primary care physicians have lower levels of training than do the specialists, but people sort of go through the system, so that you have your family doctor in your neighborhood, and then if you need more advanced medical care, you move to a polyclinic or to a specialty hospital.
Right.
So Cuba has both a huge emphasis on primary care training and very excellent higher level training.
Okay, so this is the question. So why do we want to demonize it? Why would we take a country that was busy doing its own thing, trying to treat its people like valued human beings? Why do we demonize it?
That's what the Cubans always ask us. They always say, we don't like the way you do things in your country, but we never tried to interfere. Like, we think it's up to you to change your country if you want to change your country. We've never tried to tell you how we think you should do things. Why do you have to come tell us how we should do things? Let us figure it out.
Answer? That's why we have you here. What is the answer?
What is the answer? Is that the United States doesn't let other countries do things their way. The United States is an imperial power in the Americas, and we have never let a Latin American country go its own way to do things differently from the way we think they should do it. No Latin American country has ever intervened in the United States. The United States has intervened in practically every Latin American country. We invaded and occupied Nicaragua. We invaded and occupied the Dominican Republic. We invaded and occupied Haiti. We invaded and occupied Cuba. We helped overthrow a government in Brazil. We helped overthrow a government in the Dominican Republic.
All these democratic governments in
Nicaragua, in
Chile,
and
we attempted coups in Venezuela, which is very much like Cuba in that it was attempting to meet the needs of its people.
And just recently succeeded in overthrowing a government, a democratically elected government in Honduras. So the United States is a bully in Latin America.
Under Hillary was Secretary of State, and she was involved in partially what she calls smart politics, which is helping to overthrow Honduras without anybody here knowing about it.
I mean, there has never been an American government that has renounced the use of force to impose the political changes that we want for our own benefit in Latin America.
So for our own benefit, you mean when they decided to help their people, that meant that the companies couldn't come in and like take 90% of the oil and leave 5% of the value there, so impoverishing these oil-rich countries and taking all the profits back. That's our interest, right?
Yes, thank you. I should qualify when I say our interest. our government defines our interest generally as the interest of the multinationals. Like, it's not
Right.
necessarily in your interest or my interest, but it's in the interest of the multinationals.
Right,
It's in the
to
interest
get
of
the
profits.
resources of the other countries without paying them. And don't you think this is part of it too? Think of it, here's a little country without money. Nobody's homeless, people have free medical care, you can go to college without having money, you're not hungry, and here we are, a wealthiest country in the world, I guess. That's the only number one thing we are beside prison inmates. And yet we have kids who are have malnutrition.
Yes, I think the need to demonize.
If we accepted them, people would say, if they can do that there, why can't we get those same benefits?
The need to demonize alternative political and economic systems in order to show that ours is the best has also, I think, been really a constant in U.S. economic policy, and certainly part of the Cold War, and continuing in the post-Cold War period, if this is a post-Cold War period. If you look at U.S. Internal government correspondence from the time of the Cuban Revolution, and where they're starting to make these decisions, like, should we support this revolution or should we oppose this revolution? And the U.S. ambassadors and the State Department are quite open in their internal correspondence that Cuba is trying to use its resources to help its own people. And we don't want Latin American countries to do that, because that is going to prejudice the interests of U.S. businesses. And if we allow Cuba to do this, other countries are going to want to do it too. And we can't let that happen.
And we would lose all the resources of Latin America, which is why we have demonized Chavez, who's a good guy too, dead now, unfortunately. So what do you think? I'm suggesting that everybody who can go to Cuba should go to Cuba. I loved it there. And what do you think is the advantage to your students?
I think one of the things that meant the most to students was being able to go out in the street and talk to people themselves. That is, there's always the suspicion, if you're on an organized trip, that you're seeing sort of like set up or canned places and events. But the students had a lot of free time to go out and talk to people and experience for themselves and develop their own responses and opinions to what's going on in Cuba.
We're going to interview one of Avi's students, a girl named Yaira. She was very excited about what she learned. And I think you can ask the Cubans about their government.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They love to talk about their government.
I took this course primarily because as a student of international relations, I felt like Cuba was a big piece that I wasn't introduced to, that I didn't have any kind of background knowledge on. I was never receiving any kind of news or hearing about them on the global spectrum, but I was aware that this revolution had happened years before and that they were rather controversial. And around that time that the study travel had come out was when the first few whisperings of diplomatic relations opening again had been released. So for me, taking this course was about being able to learn about the revolution, which was a big social movement that was extremely fascinating and just not very lauded in American history or like in America in general. But then also being able to try to open a door to something that was completely unbeknownst to me. My first impression was that it was just beautiful. Architecturally, it was gorgeous. You saw a lot of the influence of like Spanish architecture there. But definitely my first impression was that it was something that I would not be able to fully understand unless I had lived there and unless I had gotten the full picture in terms of how people engaged with their country, because as an outsider there were things that I just couldn't understand. As somebody growing up in the United States with a capitalist economic system, with a what we call a democracy, there are just things that I had to certainly learn how to decondition myself from assuming and thinking while I was there. 3 young men who were in a band called Sonash, they are extremely talented and play mostly like acoustic guitar and sing. In the middle of his performance, his string had just broken, but he continued to carry on. And after the fact, he had mentioned to us that because of the lack of resources available to them coming in, because of the blockade, he wasn't always able to afford getting strings, so he had to learn how to be resourceful and play with a string missing or a string broken because it cost a good amount of money to find one off the market. I was able to meet some students from their School of International Relations, which is a school that's entirely focused on that. So it was, I think for me, that was the highlight of my trip, meeting other students whose academic focus was the same as mine, and being able to just like talk about that, but then also see their personalities and listen to their music and see how they interpret our music and our pop culture. Ooh. That was very fun. Absolutely that I have to start broadening my lenses, being critical in different ways, and just genuinely looking at things from a much less general perspective, in terms of thinking of Cuba as just their government or just who is calling the orders on their government, but looking at it as a country that has people that deserves to be able to progress, that deserves to be able to
play music.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think for me it was really just proof that the complexity that exists on this planet shouldn't be looked down on as people unable to throw down a government that the United States isn't satisfied with, or people who aren't acting. You know, a big debate that came up was the free speech thing, and even seeing how different interpretations of freedom of speech is from an American to a Cuban has been really influential in how I've been engaging with my work as an international relations student, and better taking myself and my opinions and my perspectives out of things and being able to broaden that perspective.
I'm really glad you came,
Thanks.
and go see Cuba.
Definitely go see Cuba.
There are others all around, scattered throughout the town. Reach out and you will see your numbers swell to 3. We can do it, yes we can. We can change things throughout the land, but we all must lend a hand. We can do it, oh yes we can. 'Cause the problems can all be solved with dedication and a little resolve. Obstacles slowly dissolve when we all just get involved.